teach at Korean University in Seoul, and my specialty actually, background is I worked for a long time in Japan and Korea, but I also studied the modernization of Chinese history. So it starts from, probably you studied, have you ever been to China, Korea, or Japan? Nobody, okay. Oh, you did? Okay, very good. Where have you been? Which country?
Korea.
Korea, you?
Korea.
Oh, very good, okay. And today's class will focus on the modernization of East Asia. So when we say East Asia, we usually include Korea, Japan, and China. And we have other parts of Asia, what we call them is Southeast Asia, will be Thailand, Cambodia, and all that is Southeast Asia. But we today focus on East Asia or Northeast Asia. And then when we say modernization, when we say China, Japan, Korea, sometimes you hear like China, sometimes you hear 中国 or 中华, you hear a lot of these things. It's all meaning central kingdom. 中 means central, and then 国 is a nation, but usually kingdom. Or sometimes you will hear something like Han people, H-A Han. That's the majority of a race in China. And then sometimes you will hear Tang people, which is the older dynasty. So it all includes the referring to Chinese people, whether you hear Zhongguo or Zhonghua or Han people or Tang people. And Japan, usually you may hear like something like Nippon or Nihon. Or you may hear Yamato, something like that. If you hear, it's all referring to Japan. And as you know, first of this month we have a new emperor. His name is made. Do you anybody remember what's the new emperor's name? Reiwa is currently it's Heisei, H-E-I-S-E-I, Heisei, but it's changed to Reiwa beginning next month, but they made the name first now. And then the old name of Japan used to be called the Jibangu, so that's all referring to Japan. Now we have names of China and Japan and Korea. Usually you may hear like Hankook, or Joseon or Chosen. Or you may hear Goryeo, which derives from Goryeo to Korea is actually the name it derived from. So Goryeo or Korea or Joseon, all these also referring to Korea. So we have all these East Asian three countries in your sort of memories. It is a little less than the United States. It's from the east to the west. It's about 2,600 miles. It's about 4,200 kilometers. And from North Russian borders down to Hainan, which is like Hawaii of China, it's about 4,000. So it's 5 hours from east to west and 5 hours from north to south. So you can imagine from New York to Los Angeles, it's 6 hours, it's 5 hours, so it's pretty much a huge land. But with the people about 5 times more than the United States, so it's 1.4 billion versus the United States 265 million. And China now you can see is divided also. Usually when you go to China, they will ask you where you're from north or south. Is it 北方人 or 还是南方人 they would say. So they go by the northern people usually tall, and they're more of nomads, and then southern people more farmers, and then they tend to be a bit darker. So that, and then also now the current provinces are divided by 34 provinces. So if you go to China these days and visit them, you'll have something Sheng. There's the first province is pronounced as Sheng. So it's like state of this, state of that. There's 34 states, and only the 2 special administrative regions are, including Hong Kong and Macau. Those are they're more autonomous, so they can manage themselves. And now also Chinese geography-wise, there are big 3 rivers, which usually you probably heard of Yellow River, which is one of also the largest near Beijing in the north, And then you go a bit south, and then we have a Yangtze River, or they call it the Long River, which pretty much provides most of the water for the agriculture and the farming, which is very important water. And if you go to south near the Guangdong and Hong Kong, we have Xijiang, which is West River. So those are three big rivers. And those are pretty much sums up, just give you, because you've not been there, I just want to give you what it looks like in China. You can imagine that from south north and west east, and there are three rivers. Now, Korea, we have two students who've been there, so probably they know very well. But now it is currently divided North and South Korea, and it's between China and Japan. So usually it has worked in the past as sort of bridging country. When Japan wants to occupy Manchuria during the World War II, it had to go through Korea. And Korea had to open up its land to Japanese, and when actually Chinese in old times, it was access to Korea with free hand. It's called the tributary nation. So the Koreans had to give gifts twice a year, make sure that they don't invade Korea. It's called the tributary state. And now Korean geography, it's a small country, and then it's about pretty much the size of Utah, but you probably don't know how large Utah is either. But anyway, the north is full of natural minerals, and then the topography pretty much is a relatively immobile population, because in Confucianism, it was believed that if you leave your own nation you're born with, you're basically cursed. So nobody really left their hometown until they die. So it's relatively immobile, and then also they're focused on the agriculture in the past. It recently changed a lot, but we're talking about the before the modernization. And then Korean geography will have several states, but most importantly, what you have to remember is, well, the capital is Seoul, and then also it respecting for land and farming, and thus maritime transportation and other industries were relatively delayed until real opening up of nation after the World War II. And the following Korea, the next country in the east of Korea is Japan. And then you can see that the Japanese now, as we studied, is composed of 4 big islands. And then it is mountainous, and then shorter sort of fast-running rivers. And then also we studied it in the south is Kyushu Island, and when Tokyo and Osaka is called Honshu. So this is the largest portion of the island. And then Shikoku is the smallest island where the very strong samurai cliques were actually thrived. You heard about the Meiji Reformation in your class? Okay. Anybody that can recall it? The strongest samurai cliques came from this small island and also Kyushu area. And Hokkaido used to be only resided by Ainu race. They looks like Russians actually, very hairy and white. But they are conquered by or annexed by the Japanese after the Meiji Reformation, and then so it became Hokkaido. And the old name is Ezo, the red letter. So it used to be Ezo, but it's annexed to Japan, and the name changed to Hokkaido. Now, the Japanese also, you probably heard of Kansai, Kanto. It's divided, the Honshu is divided big. The Tokyo and Osaka area is called the Kanto area, and Kansai is where the Kyoto was the old capital of Japan before the emperor used to live there, but after the Meiji Reformation, he moved to Tokyo, current Tokyo area. And then population grew quite big early 1800s. So 30 million around 1800 is comparable to that of London and as well as the Paris. So it already had quite the metropolitan sort of the size and the facilities early on. Now, we'll compare very briefly about the East Asian culture, and it's very dangerous to have a very stereotypical sort of Koreans are like this, Japanese are like that, and then Chinese are like this. It's not, as you can easily imagine, the country's culture has been all very fluxed each other. It's like you can say Italians and French and let's say Italian, French, and Spanish people, how you can think of, imagine different characteristics, but a lot of times it has a common overlapping areas. So Koreans as well as Japanese borrowed the Chinese letters. You probably heard of kanji or hanja. It's all we borrowed from Chinese letters, but we actually revised into their own language. So, for example, Japanese during the Heian period, they borrowed, but they made their own letters. It's called kana. It was katakana and hiragana, two words, but they combined with the Chinese words. That's how it worked. In Korea, in 1443. King Sejong, his name is S-E-J-O-N-G, King Sejong developed Korean's own alphabet. So it's called the Hangul. So a lot of times in the Chinese letters plus Hangul, you'll see like in the newspapers and the broadcasting companies. Those are the major, the structure of Asian languages. So Japanese made their own the kana, but all works with the Chinese letter, and the Korean also developed the Hangul, but it also works with the Chinese letters. So we all need the Chinese letter. And then also, as we talked about Confucianism and collectivity, Confucianism was made by whom? But Confucianism was made by whom? Who made Confucianism? Very good. His name is Confucius. So it's Confucius. What he said was made into Confucianism around 500 BC. But what we know right now as Confucianism to manage a nation is called the Neo-Confucianism. This was redeveloped based on the old Confucianism and the new Neo-Confucianism around the 1600. So this is changed a bit in the characters of how they manage people, etc. But those two things, just to remember, Confucianism BC 500 around, and the new Confucianism around 1600. And followed by Confucius, there was a Mencius. Mencius is his name, and then he's also another great teacher in Confucianism. So he was a BC 300 around. So with Confucius as well as Mencius, they make a classic book called The Four Books and Five Classics. These are the most important textbooks you have to remember when you want to become a gentleman in China. But it's a huge, vast number of books, and then you have to remember all these letters. As you probably studied some part of Chinese, you have to remember each letter, and then they have to remember most of probably about 300,000 letters to read these books very freely. So it needs a lot of practice every day. You have to read and train yourself. But we'll see later on, this did not have much of a value toward the science or technology. This was the problem. Some of the Asian society, mother was the most important figure, and around her there is a families. But in Confucianism, patriarchy the father was the most important, and then above father, who was their emperor. So always emperor and father. Emperor is for the nation, and father for the family. Those are two most important figures. And in Japan and then also Korea, it's a very similar structure. Until recently, it's equality and the gender, the rights were quite strong in modern nations. It changed, but until that modernization, it shared a very similar patriarchism in the family in three nations. So with that, the patriarchy and in mind, also there was a hierarchy based on class. That everywhere you went before demodernization, there was hierarchy. In England, you go to, there's hierarchy. Still have some of the hierarchy in England. We have what working class, and then also middle class, and also the all different structure. And in Asia, they also had the hierarchy based on their profession. We'll study that later. And then also the family relation hierarchy. The father was on top, and then all other family members were actually following the father's instruction. But the first son was also the second man in charge. Even his right is overriding the mother's. Mother didn't really count for any power. So the first son, and then before him was the father. And also, as I said, the class hierarchy was the most prominent feature of Confucianism. And here we see there are like four major class hierarchy here. It's the Shi, Long, Gong, Shang. And the Shi is usually what it refers to is people who studied and passed the exam, or at least they studied this, the textbooks we talked about. So learned people who are scholars. The Shi, but in China and Korea, to a certain extent, it's very important. All these Shi people passed the state exam. If you didn't pass the state exam, then you have another title. But you have to pass the state exam that you are really made it successful, your career and your family, all the glories for you. So everybody was who was inspired to be a good scholar had to study this exam, but it was so difficult to pass. So in the society actually, there were so many people who studied and then they didn't pass. Then they become very angry about the system. So there will be lots of rebellion in Chinese history. Later on we'll see it. So after Shi, we'll see Nong is the farmers. It's also majority of population was farmers in China, in Korea, in Japan. And now Nong, why you think this is quite interesting? Because this also shows mainly. If you see the third lower rank is what artisans, and the fourth lower is merchants. But in the West, if you are good artisans, like making things, and also if you're a merchant, you may have a better ranking or class, right? So in Asia, actually, merchants were the lowest sort of respected class. This may also made a sort of effect that it couldn't develop further, like banking or even merchant banking or merchandising, all that. So that may has to do with the hierarchy based on Confucianism. That why Asian countries, particularly China and Korea, didn't develop into these big industrious countries or the big banking-oriented countries, because it has been quite disrespected in the lower rank. So that's also part of Confucianism you may want to remember. And then also what they demanded is that the nation, the government always demanded that you always cultivate yourself and to be a moral being. And then also by practicing the rituals. The rituals are a very important thing in China. But as you can see, this doesn't really give you any of a chance to study science or technology or developing anything. This is basically based on farming, where the majority of people are farmers and produce, and they pay tax to the government, and then they study, sitting on the bureaucrats, a huge number of bureaucrats. So this also may be one of the reasons it got delayed from modernizing itself earlier on. And then also, men are perfectible, that's what they believe. They constantly demand you to be exercising your morality and study higher, to be a higher being. So this was later used by Mao Zedong, who actually took the power after the revolution. And whenever he wanted to purge people, they actually asked to become a moral sort of debate. They criticized himself and in front of people why I was wrong to be rich, landowner, all that was going through during the so-called the Cultural Revolution in 1960s in Mao Zedong. Now, we have that. Let's keep in mind that what Confucianism, how it affected the class hierarchy in China. Those are the big sort of pictures. Now, let's go to Japan. Japan, they are quite good at the borrowing culture, including letters and then also how to make the ceramics, etc. But Japanese are excellent to make it their culture of their own. Once they borrowed, they will constantly make better, and then they will make a Japanese one culturally. So now, if you see lots of Japanese culture, it looks authentic. It's Japanese, but if you go back, actually, if you go down to the root, it may come from somewhere else, but the Japanese were excellent at making their own synthesizing what they borrowed. And then also, they borrowed the kanji from the Chinese at first. Then also, if you see the kanji is Satoshi, it's called, but hiragana is when you write in Japanese in Japanese form, hiragana. But if you borrowed from foreign language, then they will use the katakana. So usually you will see any English words like hamburger or bus, television will be katakana. What? And Korea, now Korea, it's peninsular, as I mentioned, it's a peninsula that actually connects, bridging Japan and China. And then civilization in Korean peninsula is a very close relationship with China. Koreans always regarded the Chinese as big brother, so they always respected. And then Japan, they regard it as a friend, equal level. So it has been their diplomatic sort of relationship. Respect China and then friend with Japan is their the slogan. And then, as you can see, Koreans also, they developed to the ultimate level of rituals. Chinese gave up on this, but Koreans really maintained. So this first photo on the left is, what do you think they are doing? What kind of ceremony does it look like they're doing?
Dead people?
Huh? Dead people? That's right. You can see two photos, so it must be dead. So each year on the day of death of their parents, they have to do this ceremony. And on the right, on the opposite, is somebody is getting married, probably. So they are doing all these rituals. So rituals are the most important thing for Koreans to maintain its identity. So also in Korea, it's a hereditary aristocracy. So it's inherited from your family. And then, unlike a class in Japan, for example, samurai class later becomes an ordinary citizen. But in Korea, they respected more who study letters. We studied the shi. But if you're a military person, then they did not really respect. So they really actually separated this who are military and as well as who are governor of the office. And then also Korea there is a very few ethnic minorities. They argue it's a consanguinity. What is a consanguinity? In Latin word, bond is with sanguinidad or sanguinity, one blood only. So they only get together. The Koreans are quite strong about this one race kind of. But recently, actually, it opened up quite a lot. So about 10% of Korean population now are foreigners in Korea. So those are pretty much now, we now have some idea, even though it's very brief and outlining, with Korean culture, Japanese culture, where they're located, or people are like, etc. And so some of the people, again, this is if you just think this way, it's a bit dangerous, but it gives you sort of a stereotypical type of imagining what they think is China. Again, collectivity, we, and if you go only I, then you are regarded as a very selfish person. So if your 5 friends are going out, if they take all 4 different people have one food, and if you say something else, then you are sort of regarded out of the group, so you go with the flow, and then consensus oriented. While Japan is very similar, but another Japan is for sure it's called reciprocity, is one of the most important character. If you receive it, you must reciprocate, even the better ones. So that's there in their mind. So if you receive one present, they are dying to give you back either equal or better ones. So always, that's the case. In Korea, similar, we, and then also they look at the consensus as a way of achieve harmony. And then also individualism is regarded as a selfish sort of behavior. And we look at some of the scholars of Ching, she's American Chinese, and she talked about also important thing is loyalty in Confucianism. Loyalty is toward your nation, that you are loyal to China, you're loyal to Korea, you're loyal to Japan. Well, also we have another thing, and that's like at the public level, but private level, we have a xiao. Xiao is what? Filial piety. It's similar to your loyalty to your nation. If you have a piety toward your parents, so you are submitted, you are loyal to your parents. So emperor is a nation, and then your parents are 2 big pillars. You always have to submit yourself. But you can always, whenever I say this, you can always think, okay, there are so many responsibilities, so many obligations, but in Asia, and before the modernization, there's little rights. I have to do this, I have to submit myself, I have to be loyal, I have to reciprocate, but what is my right? I cannot do this, I can do this, I can do this, but nobody really tells you your rights. So in the West, the rights, you have in front of derecho, it's like your individual right is very important, but in Asia actually this didn't come until the modernization. So just bear in mind the obligations and also culture, some of the context. And now we are looking at the Western influence. I put here a bit of historical facts of when was the first contact from the West to the East. Let's say that around the 15th century, Europeans explored the African coast first, and then 1492, Christopher Columbus went around or reached America. And then also around the 1500, European economies were largely self-sufficient, but they now needed natural resources to expand their economy. At the beginning, probably they did trading spice. If you read the medieval recipe of Western food, it's like, well, they don't have any spice. Salt was very expensive. Where do you think salt was most traded? One of the largest European city in medieval time. Salt was their biggest trading material. Very good. Yeah, your professor got it because in German, Salz is salt rice, and then Burg, Salzburg is the biggest the trading area. And then also India produced most of pepper. Peppercorns are very expensive, so the old Portuguese went there and then explored the area. And then, so at the beginning it's a spice, but later on expanded to different natural gold. Of course, Spanish people love the South American silver. You have Argentina, but it's, the origin of Argentina is the silver is the origin, right? And then so that, and then also rivalry between the European powers was actually clashing each other, Dutch, British, and French. And as you know, first it was pretty much the Spain and Portugal, but later on the power actually gave it to more England and the Dutch, and then later on the British actually pretty much got hand on all this trading by establishing the East India companies in different cities. And now let's look at the briefly of historical events of what happened. That interaction could be possible was 1700 Industrial Revolution, and then 1776 American Revolution, and then 1789 the French Revolution. Those are times very volatile time, and then particularly what's important, the French Revolution is important, is that now if you look at the so-called language side, before the French Revolution, a lot of scholars, most scholars used, what kind of language we were using before the Revolution? If you are well-learned people in France and have old sort of attitude, they all spoke in Latin, right? Even though it's very difficult, they have to communicate in Latin. But vernacular became, after the pretty much revolution, currently French became after the revolution. So here, why I'm introducing this is we're focusing on language today, and it's important. The people, vernacular, people's spoken word and the written word should be merging together to make the power of the people. So we'll see that China there will also take place. That's why I'm introducing this. And then around that time, if you see 1792, the first British trading sort of mission were sent to China, but Chinese rejected them very gracefully. We don't need anything from you. We don't need the trading. But later on, the Chinese had to open the door because Britain found the best item to trade is opium. So that's pretty much opened China for the first time. That's why we said modernization also has to be something to do with the Western power, and this is what we're referring to. And now, what happened in Japan was around that time, Japanese were very observant. They were watching what's happening with China, and they saw China went through a disaster. They all destroyed all this. They have opened the port from Shanghai to Nanjing, and then also down to Guangzhou. So what they did was they were willing to negotiate. They don't want to go through a war. So Commodore Matthew Perry first arrived in Japan in 1853 in a big ship, and then he said, I'll come back 1 year later, and by then you decide what you want to do, whether you want to have a war or you open up your country. So Japanese, intelligently, they opened up. Yes, okay, we open for you. And then that's Matthew Perry is American. He was also a whale ship captain. So now you can see China first opened up by the British people through the Opium War, and Japan without any war, Matthew Perry by just opening up and agreeing to their conditions. Now, we pretty much let's sort of summarize what we so far covered. So the first time when pretty much Chinese and Western story came together was around the Opium time, Opium War time. Until then, that Chinese history and the Western history went all separate ways, but actually it merged into one because they interacted for the first time at the time. And then first the Opium War was point of departure. That's a lot of scholars argue that. And then also the Qing autocracy the Qing dynasty had a very close sort of grip on the people, and then rights of people were not really allowed. But after around this time, it will open up to more of the Western concept of freedom and then rights, etc. So that's the one point. And the second is that how we regard this modernization of China. We have to look at the Western powers and the cross-cultural context, but we also have to give some credit to Chinese own autonomous efforts to make the country more modern. So we have to look at both ways. There is influence from the West as well as the Chinese autonomous sort of efforts within. Now, let's go back to where we started at the Xinong Gongshang, the class hierarchy, and then on top, Shi people, the scholars, they studied night and day to pass the civil examination, and then because it actually assured wealth and power and influence, so everybody had to go through this. And they start usually by preparing for this state exam at the age of 5. Until 17, you have to study night and day and to pass this. Otherwise, you will not have the best job, but you have an okay job. It's called literates, and in Chinese it's called literates. And then they will be always one step down from the people who actually passed the exam. So that everybody was dying to pass the exam. And this became a huge problem, and the language-wise, as well as also the sort of waste of people and resources, all that you can imagine. So now let's look at the language. Why this is important in the modernization of Asia or China in this case? Because language is important. It's a socio-political, as well as now, if you compare with the Chinese language and the Western language, China did not have much of structures, grammar. In the West, you start with the grammar. There is a verb, there is objective, and then go, and then past tense, etc. But Chinese, you start repeating it by memorizing. If you go to school, like 100 students sit down, and the teacher says something, you follow, and teacher says something, you follow, you repeat, and you follow. And then finally, you actually going through reciting whole these sentences, not by scientifically studying the grammar. So that's also pointed out one of the reasons why the Chinese people didn't develop this logical thinking early on. Because if you studied the grammar, you always argue, okay, that's grammatically wrong because you have to have like past perfect tense or the future or etc. But China, when you learn the first language level, that you repeating after the teacher. So that's also they pointed out. And then also, this may be also related to if you didn't have language, a grasp of language, then the public opinion and media cannot really develop, right? You cannot read the newspaper, you cannot argue what your points are, etc. So the language is all related to the modernization, media, public opinion, and logical thinking. And then also, now uniting the people together is also very important to have one language. If you have several dialects and do not understand each other, you may have, as a leader, it may be very difficult to unite people in a one sort of opinion or argue on something. So language was one of the most important cultural element in modernization. And some of the scholars, particularly like Daguvala, she's an Oxford scholar, and she says most important to make the nation among all is also the usage of vernacular. Vernacular language is the most important element. And one of the Chinese scholar Fei argues that it's like a society sifter. It's like filter. So they filter what's important through the language. And if you're too big, too small, it doesn't really fall into the whole society's groove. So he argues like that, and the Juara also argues that you can manipulate people with language for certain cases, etc. So all these three scholars argued the importance of language in the modernizing nation. And so some of the Western scholars, Saussure already, and Bourdieu, but he's always the most important linguistic person, and then all that argue that it's a core element of a cultural society that shapes the national identity, how important languages. Of course, Habermas talks about the purpose of languages to understand common sort of communication among the citizens. So given this, why China was left behind was, let's look at the sort of discourse analysis of Sun Yat-sen's writing. Who was Sun Yat-sen? Anybody knows? Okay, no idea, right? Okay, very good. Sun Yat-sen was the first president of Chinese Republic. So it has been all dynasty for thousands of years, and there was a revolution that happens in 1911, and then Sun Yat-sen was the first president as a modern nation's father, and then he is the national figure and the father of the Taiwan, because he was pushed out by Mao Zedong later, and he fled to Taiwan, and he actually has a ROC, Republic of China, versus now if you see the continental China, they write it PRC. What PRC stand for? People's Republic of China. So it's two different. But Sun Yat-sen was the first president of Chinese Republic, and then now on his teaching is carried on in Taiwan. Now let's look at what he wrote, and let's figure out why Chinese the modernization was delayed. He actually was very interested in, Sun Yat-sen was very interested in languages, and he always compared with Western language and Chinese language. And he said the European language are phonology based. Can anybody know what is phonology based? Or what is the Chinese word called? Ideograph? Or, ideograph is not phonology. You cannot read as you, because there is no alphabet, right? So phonology based is pretty much, you can easily think it's alphabet based. So even though you don't know the meaning, you can read it. It's phonology based. So he argues that, and then also in the Western there is a system of grammar. We talked about you learn grammar first to learn any language, but in China you have to learn by repeating after the teacher the language sound, etc. And so he commented, European countries all pursue the learning of grammar, and he also says grammar served as the key to write correctly, which is correct, right? If you know the grammar, then you follow grammar, and then you can write grammatically correct sentences. But if you didn't know this and only repeat what teachers say, then you may not know how exactly correct the sentences are. And he also said that he studied several years by repeating what teachers say, but we are not able to compose even a single word unless they recite articles by their predecessors and mimic their writing style. So all they have to do to be learned is to recite and mimic what other people did. They have to be a good scholars this way, not knowing logically the grammar correctly to write your own sentences. And so either way, you all know about everything, or you don't know anything about after even 10 years of struggling it, because Sun Yat-sen struggled with the Chinese language, and then he said that after all these years, I still don't know what exactly I'm saying, because I'm repeating what other people are saying. And so Sun further analyzed the style of Chinese writings. Then he argued that there's some problem with the pedagogy. What is pedagogy? Is way of teaching, right? The method of teaching, pedagogy. And so now Chinese pedagogy is not really encouraging for you to learn logically. logically, that he argues, and that they do not seek through understanding. So you have to know a language through understanding, but you don't understand, but you just follow what other people are saying. So the synthesis of logic is an innate capability of humankind. It becomes very grand here. But when they're asked to how to get logic, they cannot answer. Even teachers cannot. Probably they will hit the students, and in those days it's very common. And they just follow whatever they're saying, but don't ask this kind of questions, kind of thing. So he argues that we cannot really learn logically. And so when he also saw there is a translation, and so he argues to avoid too narrow interpretation. He was quite advanced because he used to live in Hawaii for a long time, so he was exposed to this Western culture quite early on. And understanding language was the most needed. And so he now argues the following. Now, the cultural connections to surrounding Asian nations, we all share the Chinese language together, but other nations also, they can develop more of grammar-based, but we should actually develop our own sort of grammar and logical thinking through modernizing our language. So Son actually believed the underlying cause of the absence of China's unity and modernization was we don't have vernacular Chinese language, as well as we don't have written logical grammar. So he concluded this way. So he argued that we need more necessity of more inclusive education. Also, in China, if you don't understand that you're left behind, or if you don't have the right background, you are not included. But inclusion is quite a different thinking in the past, around this time, modernization, because inclusion is not really the word that was commonly understood before the modernization, including everybody, including. So in Chinese it's called baorong. And so you have to include everybody is what he argued for. And then he says if you're learned enough, if you're already a scholar, then you don't need this, but we need bridge that leading to the next sort of destination if there's a river. So to cross this river, we need the language and then also understanding logically. That's what he actually argued. Now, this is my conclusion before I close it. So I usually leave it open for you to think all what we sort of today learned. But the implications of this class is that now Chinese language was more exclusionary. It didn't include everybody who didn't understand, but by repeating it, whatever they did for 100 years or so, the exclusionary aspect of Chinese language resulted from the absence of clearly stipulated grammar, and then also scholars' attitude or pedagogy. And then also linguistic unity would be connecting to political unity, because you have to understand what the politicians are arguing about, and you have to learn by reading it. And then also some urged Chinese scholars to fulfill their responsibility in educating students to gain logic rather than just repeating on and on, but to get the logic, to get more modernized. And then finally, linguistic inclusion, as we talked about, corresponded to collective power of Chinese people, because of, this also corresponds to Confucian, the sort of the belief that everybody should be included under the collective sort of rights in learning. So this will conclude today's sort of sharing with modernization in East Asia and cultural socio-modernization. So even though it's very briefly, I touched upon different things, so it may give you some idea what you want to study further in the future. Okay, thank you.